Hello and welcome to my video on the German slip stitch Selvedge. If you're wondering what selvage means, it basically just means the edge, but it's the edges that run down the sides of the knitting, here, rather than the end. In this video I'm going to be showing you how to add the German slip stitch selvage to the regular stockinette stitch. Now if you don't know already, stockinette stitch is one row of knit stitches, one row of purl stitches, and then alternate between those two rows. Here on the edge you can see the effect that the German slip stitch edging actually gives you, which is a lovely smooth chain down the selvage edges of your knitting. It's a lot smoother than what you normally get when you just knit stockinette stitch normally, and I think it just gives a really nice finish. All that this technique requires you to do is add on a different stitch at the end of each row when you're knitting your normal stockinette stitch. So it's just the last stitch in each row of your stockinette stitch that differs. The first thing you need to do is cast on your stitches. If you're just practicing, then just cast on about 10 stitches or so you can practice along with me. Just ignore all of this knitting that I've previously done and follow me from this point onwards. So you start as you normally would when knitting stockinette stitch and start with knit stitch. Remember, with knit stitches you start with the yarn at the back behind the needles. So you simply do knit stitches along almost the whole first row. The only thing different is the very last stitch. So knit stitch up to that last stitch. And now we've come to the last stitch in the row. Notice that the yarn is at the back behind the needles still, but the last stitch, what we're going to do is we're going to slip it purlwise. Now normally when you're slipping something purlwise or you're purling a stitch, the yarn will be at the front, but in this case we're going to leave the yarn at the back behind the needles. All you have to do is take your right hand needle, go down through the stitch on your left needle as if you're going to then purl it, but instead of purling it, you just simply slip that stitch off the end of the needle. You will now notice that the working yarn comes from the second stitch down on your needle rather than the top stitch, but don't let this throw you off, this is what is supposed to happen. On a side note, if you look at the knitting below, which you won't have yet, but if you just look here, the wavy pattern lets you know that this is the back or the wrong side of the knitting. The other side has a kind of chevron pattern which represents the front or the right side of your stockinette stitch. So basically you can always tell the difference between the front and the back when you're doing stockinette stitch. Now for the second row, you're going to purl like you would normally do when doing stockinette stitch. So you would purl all the way along the row except for, once again, the very last stitch, which you're going to leave until I get there. Remember that when you purl, the yarn comes from the front of the needles, which is nearest to you. These first two purl stitches can be a little bit loose, so just make sure you tighten them up sufficiently. And now we're at the last stitch once more, and with the yarn at the front this time, we slip the stitch purlwise, just like in the previous row. So you go in to the stitch, down through the stitch, as if you're going to purl it, and then you just slip it off the end of the needle. And then we swap the needles between our hands once again, and we're back on the front again, as you can see with the chevron pattern on the stockinette stitch. there we have it. First row is all knit stitches except for the last stitch, which you slip purlwise with the yarn in the back. And then the next row is all purl stitches, and then you slip the last stitch purlwise once again, but with the yarn in the front. And you just repeat these 2 rows over and over again. And that's all you need to know. I'm now repeating those 2 rows for you in case you want to follow along once more. So here I am doing knit stitches all along the row except for the very last stitch. And then for the last stitch in the row, you keep the yarn behind the needles and slip the last stitch purlwise. And now we're on to the 4th row. And just like every other even numbered row, it's all purl stitches except for the very last stitch, which you once again slip purlwise. And finally you slip the very last stitch purlwise, and that completes my demo. And now I'll just show you one final time the edges that you produce with this technique to show you how smooth the edge finish actually is. Each chain on the edge travels over 2 rows. And I think it is a really greatly improved finish to the normal stockinette stitch edge. I hope you've been able to follow along, and thanks very much for watching.